The historical record, however, complicates that logic in important ways. Israel's 1981 strike on Iraq's Osirak reactor was widely assessed at the time as a decisive blow against Saddam Hussein's nuclear ambitions. In retrospect, the strike appears to have accelerated Iraq's nuclear program by pushing it underground and into a more dispersed, covert architecture that proved harder to monitor and target. The 2007 Israeli strike on Syria's Al-Kibar facility was operationally successful in destroying that specific site, but Syria's broader strategic behavior did not fundamentally change as a result. Destroying infrastructure does not destroy knowledge, institutional capability, or political will. Iran's nuclear program has been built with the explicit assumption that it would face military pressure, and its key facilities, particularly Fordo, buried deep beneath a mountain, were engineered to survive conventional strikes. Multiple hits from the GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator, delivered by B-2 stealth bombers, may be required to guarantee destruction of the deepest facilities, and even then, the question of reconstitution remains open. The retaliatory dimension introduces risks that extend well beyond the immediate military exchange. Iran possesses a large and diverse ballistic missile arsenal. Its network of regional proxy forces in Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, and Syria provides distributed retaliatory capability that cannot be neutralized in a first strike. A significant Iranian retaliation against Israeli population centers, Gulf state infrastructure, or American bases across the region would produce casualties and economic disruption at meaningful scale. The Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of global oil supply passes, would face immediate disruption risk, with consequences for global energy markets and the broader international economy that are difficult to fully model in advance. There is also a dimension of political risk inside Iran that receives less attention than the military calculus. The Islamic Republic has demonstrated over 4 decades a remarkable capacity to survive external pressure. The devastating Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, which killed hundreds of thousands and destroyed significant portions of the country's infrastructure, did not collapse the regime. It strengthened it by providing a unifying external threat. Decades of economic sanctions, while inflicting genuine hardship on the Iranian population, have not produced the political fracturing that has sometimes been predicted. A military strike carries a real, if uncertain, risk of producing a similar dynamic, suppressing internal dissent, empowering hardliners, and consolidating nationalist sentiment around a regime that can present itself as a victim of foreign aggression. That outcome would represent a significant strategic setback, even if the nuclear facilities were physically destroyed. The international dimension adds yet another layer of complexity. Russia and China, both of which maintain significant economic and strategic relations with Iran, have consistently opposed American-led pressure campaigns against Tehran and would almost certainly respond to military strikes with sharp diplomatic condemnation. Russia's reaction is particularly consequential given the current state of U.S.-Russia relations and Moscow's demonstrated willingness to use energy markets as a geopolitical instrument. China, as the largest buyer of Iranian oil and a permanent member of the UN Security Council, would face pressure from its own domestic constituencies to respond visibly to what Beijing would characterize as unilateral American militarism. Neither Russia nor China would likely intervene militarily on Iran's behalf, but their political and economic responses could meaningfully complicate American strategic objectives in other theaters at a moment when Washington is already managing significant competing priorities. None of this means the military option is strategically incoherent. The Iranian negotiating position, as publicly stated, leaves very little room for a diplomatic outcome that addresses the core American and Israeli concerns. A regime that explicitly refuses to discuss its missile programs and rejects permanent limits on enrichment is not offering a pathway to the kind of verifiable, durable agreement that would reduce the threat to acceptable levels. Rubio's characterization of the situation as unsustainable reflects a genuine strategic dilemma, not simply hawkish posturing. What the current moment requires from an analytical standpoint is clarity about what military action would achieve and what it would not. It would set back Iran's nuclear timeline, potentially by several years. It would not eliminate the program permanently. It would demonstrate American and Israeli resolve and capability. It would also trigger a regional escalation whose full dimensions are genuinely unpredictable. The forward deployment of F-22s, F-35s, and a carrier strike group creates real military options. Whether those options serve long-term strategic interests better than continued, if difficult, diplomatic engagement is a question on which serious analysts disagree, and one that the coming days or weeks may force into sharp resolution. The situation as of February 26th is genuinely unstable. The explosions inside Iran, the supreme leader's reported retreat underground, the military buildup, and the collapsed negotiations are all real and significant developments. What they add up to, whether imminent war, continued covert pressure, or a last-minute diplomatic breakthrough, remains, for now, genuinely uncertain. What is clear is that the margin for error on all sides is narrowing, and the decisions being made in Washington, Tel Aviv, and Tehran over the coming days carry consequences that will extend far beyond the immediate military and diplomatic calculations currently driving them. History rarely announces itself cleanly. It tends to arrive through the accumulation of small decisions, repositioned ships, unexplained explosions, and leaders retreating underground until the moment when the accumulated weight of those decisions becomes irreversible.
On February 26th, another large explosion occurred at an industrial complex in the southern Iranian city of Abadan. Iranian authorities attributed the blast to a gas leak, the same explanation offered after 16 previous explosions at sites across the country over recent months. Independent verification of that explanation remains unavailable, but the pattern of where these explosions are occurring has drawn significant attention from open-source intelligence analysts and regional security observers. Every incident has taken place at a location of strategic value to the Iranian state: facilities adjacent to military infrastructure, residential complexes housing Revolutionary Guard personnel, and industrial plants involved in manufacturing. The consistency of targeting, combined with the visible blast damage in footage circulating from several incidents, has led a number of analysts to assess that at least some of these events may reflect deliberate sabotage rather than industrial accident. The Abadan blast footage shows structural damage and fire spread that some explosives analysts say is inconsistent with a gas pressure failure, though no definitive forensic conclusion has been publicly established. No government or organization has claimed responsibility for any of the 17 incidents. Simultaneously, Iran International, an opposition-aligned Persian-language outlet with sources inside Iranian government and military circles, published a report claiming that Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei has relocated to a fortified underground facility beneath Tehran. According to the report, senior officials, including Ali Larijani, who has been given broad authority over Iran's security apparatus, were blindfolded during transport to meetings with Khamenei in order to protect the location from disclosure. The report further states that Khamenei's son, Mojtaba, is managing communications with key regime figures, while another son handles routine administrative matters. Iran International's reporting is generally considered credible within the community of Iran watchers, though the specific claims in this report have not been independently confirmed by other outlets. The Iranian government has not responded publicly to the report. If accurate, the account suggests a leadership operating under significant perceived threat. The decision to blindfold senior officials during transit to meet their own supreme leader indicates an unusual and acute level of operational security concern within the regime's inner circle. It also raises a practical governance question that has received little attention. A supreme leader who cannot meet his own officials without elaborate concealment procedures is a leader whose ability to make rapid, coordinated decisions during a crisis may be significantly impaired. Command structures that depend on blindfolded intermediaries and tunnel networks introduce delay, miscommunication risk, and potential for catastrophic misunderstanding at precisely the moment when clear, fast decision-making matters most. That vulnerability cuts both ways. It weakens Iranian crisis management, but it also increases the risk of miscalculation on all sides. These developments are unfolding against a backdrop of significant American military repositioning in the region. As of February 26, 11 F-22 Raptor fighter aircraft are forward deployed to Avda Air Base in southern Israel. An additional 13 F-22s from the 1st Fighter Wing are staged at RAF Lakenheath in England, following transit from Langley Air Force Base in Virginia. More than a dozen F-35 Joint Strike Fighters departed the United States on February 26, bound for Europe, with onward movement to the Middle East expected. The USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group was reported within 24 hours of arrival off Israel's coast. American naval assets previously based in Bahrain have been repositioned to open water. Each of these movements, taken individually, has precedent in routine military exercises and force posture adjustments. Taken together and in the current diplomatic context, they represent a level of concentrated offensive capability in the region that is drawing attention from military analysts. The evacuation of naval assets from Bahrain is particularly notable. Bahrain sits within range of Iranian ballistic missiles, and moving ships to open sea reduces their vulnerability to a missile exchange. Military planners typically make that kind of repositioning decision when they assess a significant probability of conflict in the near term, though it can also reflect precautionary planning rather than certainty of imminent action. The diplomatic track provides additional context for understanding the military posture. Negotiations between the United States and Iran are currently ongoing in Switzerland. Iranian officials have publicly stated their positions with unusual directness. They reject dismantling nuclear enrichment facilities, reject transferring existing uranium stockpiles, reject the principle of permanent zero enrichment, and decline to discuss their ballistic missile programs as part of any agreement. An Iranian official described enrichment as a sovereign right and indicated Tehran's maximum flexibility is a temporary, time-limited freeze, well short of what Washington has indicated it requires. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, speaking publicly this week, described the Iranian threat as unsustainable, pointing specifically to Iran's ballistic missile development program and its trajectory toward intercontinental range capability. Iranian missiles can already reach much of the Middle East and parts of Europe. Rubio's framing, unsustainable, is language that implies the situation cannot be managed indefinitely through diplomacy alone, though it stops short of explicitly endorsing military action. Israeli sources cited by I-24 News indicated that Israeli officials believe a military strike becomes more likely if the gap between American demands and Iranian positions is not significantly narrowed in the near term. Iranian military planners, according to the same reporting, are preparing for the possibility of strikes. These assessments from Israeli sources reflect Israeli strategic interests and should be weighed accordingly. Israel has consistently advocated for harder lines against Iran's nuclear program and has its own motivations for characterizing the threat as acute. At this point, it is worth stepping back from the immediate indicators and examining what a military strike against Iran would and would not accomplish, because the operational picture is more complicated than the forward deployment of stealth fighters suggests. The case for military action rests on a straightforward strategic logic. Iran is approaching nuclear threshold capability, its ballistic missile arsenal is expanding in range and quantity, and diplomatic engagement has repeatedly failed to produce binding constraints on either program. The 2015 JCPO provided a temporary framework that has since collapsed. Current negotiations show no sign of producing a durable agreement. From this perspective, military action to destroy key nuclear facilities represents the only remaining tool capable of meaningfully setting back the program.